And one day she came home and she told me she was going to be taking my class. Well, I have a confession to make. My wife has no problem telling me that I don't listen. And sometimes she's right. Sometimes listening is hard work. Sometimes I don't listen. So after a little bit of banter back and forth, I had no say in the matter. She attended a listening session that I was doing for all the preschool teachers in the region. And I dreaded it. I dreaded that session all day until it was her time, and I really tried to avoid eye contact with her when she came in. Anyway, listening can be a challenge. I mean, I have a master's degree in communication, and I know about listening, but even I sometimes don't adequately listen. Listening is a challenge. We have messages bombarding us all day, and it can be very fatiguing, actually physically fatiguing, to try to listen all the time. But I'd like to share with you some techniques that certainly would help improve your listening. And one of those techniques is called a perception check. Now, things happen. We hear things that people say, we observe things that people do, and we don't always know exactly the meaning of those behaviors. So sometimes we're left wondering, what exactly does this person mean when they sighed, when they rolled their eyes, when they made a particular comment? You can try to imagine it, but you can also directly, with that person's help, try to understand what they're saying. And that is the purview of a perception check. Now, a perception check is an encoded message that we give as feedback. So let me pause for a minute. I heard a voice clear. Do we have a question?
No, we don't. Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and proceed on. So a complete perception check has 3 parts, and it really is very easy to use. You may have used it yourself without being aware of it. We describe someone's behavior. We offer a couple of possible interpretations for the meaning of that behavior, and then we have a request for clarification. So let's say that you are explaining something to a colleague or to one of your students, for example, and all of a sudden that student pauses, kind of squinches up their face, maybe looks around, and you're left wondering what's going on with the student. You could certainly say, hey, what's going on with you? And perhaps they would tell you that maybe all you really need to do. But sometimes a perception check is useful if the risk of misunderstanding is great. You don't always have to use all 3 parts, but if the risk of misunderstanding is great, it's probably good to err on the side of completion. So let me draw or write those parts up here. The first part of a complete perception check is a description of the other person's behavior. What is behavior? If you told somebody they weren't listening to you, that would be an interpretation. If you told somebody that they weren't making eye contact with you and were checking text messages on your phone, and that because of what you're observing, you think they're not listening, you would have then described the behavior and the interpretation. You never want to present an interpretation as behavior, because very often it'll come across as judgmental, is that you know the answer, you know the reason why they're doing what they are. So stick with what's available to your senses for the behavior. The second part of a complete perception check is at least 2 possible interpretations for what that behavior means. So if somebody rolled their eyes and sighed, for example, that behavior could mean that they were bored, that they were frustrated, exasperated in some way, but it could also mean that they just thought of something that they'd forgotten. Maybe they left the water on, maybe they were supposed to give somebody a ride, who knows, but you can probably identify from your own experience times when things like that pop into your head, and maybe the nonverbals that were associated with that thought could have conveyed a message to someone else that you weren't paying attention, or you were bored, or whatever. Okay, the last part of this is a request for clarification. If you offer your possible interpretations in a tentative way, not as if they're true, that will sometimes suffice for a request for clarification. But if not, or if you just want to add an additional request, you can certainly do that. So let me see if I can give you an example. Let's say that you're sitting with your significant other at home and you mention something about your day. And that person that's sitting there is maybe reading a paper or on their computer or checking text messages, and they don't respond to you. They don't acknowledge what you told them. What you could try as a perception check would be something like this. I asked you, or was telling you about my day, and I asked you a question, but you didn't reply. That would be a description of the behavior. I was wondering if you had something really important that you were working on your phone or on your computer, or you just weren't interested in what I had to say. I'm curious. That would be a complete perception check. I can flip that order, put that in any order that I want. What I'm trying to do to convey to this other person in a way that's less likely to result in defensiveness and create noise. I'm communicating that I want to understand what you meant, but I'm not really qualified to do it without your help. So I like to refer to it as cooperative sense making. A very useful technique. It can certainly help prevent some misunderstandings that might occur. We have a little time. I'm going to, before this hour's up, I'm going to tie this perception check into the actual perception process. And then we're going to talk about how that perception process plays into the emotions that we experience. And I'll introduce you to a technique for dealing with those strong emotions. So do I have any questions so far? Comments?
You're doing so well, we don't have any questions.
Okay, well, let me fast forward a little bit here. I'm hoping, I think I still have enough room on my board. Maybe I'll get rid of this perception check.
I was going to say,
Pardon, go ahead.
I was going to say that I just the other day used the perception check in the office where I work when I noticed that the person that I work with, who had worked there for a long time, is kind of quiet. And so I wondered if I decided that maybe she would rather I didn't do some of the job that she seems to do in the kitchen. And I thought, well, I wonder if she thinks I'm being lazy because I'm not picking up what obviously needs to be done, or if she understands that I'm leaving that to her because I think she likes to do it. So I did ask her I did state those two things and asked her, what do you prefer? And, these concepts work in so many different varieties of ways that I'm just, so it's really fun to hear you say this stuff again, because it's so useful every day.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So let's talk about the perception process itself and how we actually arrive at interpretations. Well, there's some steps in the process. And the very first step, before you can make sense of anything, you've got to pay attention to it. And so the very first step in the perception process is selecting. I have to select some stimuli and filter out everything else. Now, what I would ask you all to do, because I would normally have my students do this in class, is I would like you to stop what you're doing right now, put your phones or whatever it is that you have in your hands down, and just focus on anything that you can be aware of. What you may find is there are some things going on that you weren't consciously aware of, you weren't really noticing before you did this. So go ahead. I'm going to give you just maybe about 15 or 20 seconds to do that. So would anyone like to comment on something they became aware of while focusing like that they weren't consciously aware of before?
My house is very quiet right now, so I hear a clock ticking now.
Okay, I can hear the little muffin fan on the projector. I can hear it very well. I can hear people walking past in the hallway.
I became aware of a little motor that's running to my left that I hadn't heard before.
Okay, anybody else?
I hear traffic outside. I'm noticing sunlight that's changing with the wind that's blowing the tree branches.
Okay, all right,
I
so.
also,
Go
I
ahead,
also
please.
noticed the wind blowing. I hadn't noticed it before. Wind
Okay.
blowing.
All right, so let's kind of go back to the selection process. Those things that you didn't notice before were things you didn't select. There were stimuli, they were always there. As far as physiologically, they were always inside your ears. You could, if you wanted to focus on them, you could change your focus from one thing to another. Now, there are certain factors that cause us to select some stimuli over others. The first of those is intensity. Things that are loud, bright, they stand out in some way from the others will tend to draw our attention. When things change, so if your room is dark because a cloud is passing in front of the sun, and then all of a sudden the cloud goes away, and now all of a sudden your room is bright, you will pay attention to that. So contrast or change in stimulation is another factor. Another one is repetition. If you've ever been around somebody that likes to click their pen, tap on something, eventually it probably became annoying, but maybe at first a dripping water faucet, you didn't hear it at first, but after a while, it drew your attention to it. The last one would be motives. Maybe things that you're looking for. In the morning, for example, if you go to a building you've not been to before and you're a coffee drinker or a tea drinker, and you were kind of rushed getting out of the house, maybe one of your motives would be to find some coffee or some tea. And so you're looking for signs that might point you to a cafeteria or to some little stand where you could get that beverage. And you may totally tune out everything else. Now, the next thing that we do once we select is we have to organize. We have to kind of put some kind of structure around the stimuli that we've organized. And there are things that are referred to as perceptual filters, or more precisely perceptual schema. And one of those is appearance. So just how people look. We organize people based on their physical appearance. Another one would be their interaction, how they deal with other people. We may observe them and determine, do we think this is a friendly person, an outgoing person, a shy person? Another one might be psychological. Psychological traits, for example, is that person a little bit neurotic? Are they somewhat shy, somewhat outgoing? What are they like psychologically? Another one would be their social roles. And police officer, school teacher, music teacher, student, we tend to associate a suite of characteristics depending on what way we organize someone. Another one might be membership. So a lot of times we'll see somebody with a particular logo on a jacket or maybe in a uniform, and we'll assume that they are associated with a particular type of group. Now, what is important about this is that we organize people based on what we select. And what we select isn't always what's most important. And the other thing to think about when we're talking about organization is you've heard of the term stereotyping. Well, stereotyping is when our categorizing of people becomes unrealistic. And stereotyping works in three particular steps that are associated with it. One is that we categorize people based on some easily recognizable characteristic. It could be physical characteristics, it could be skin color, it could be the way they're dressed, the way they carry themselves. And once we have put people in a compartment, we tend to give them a whole suite of other characteristics that go along with that. The problem is that those people in that category don't all have those kind of characteristics, but we assume that it's true and we relate to them as if it were true. Third, once we've categorized and once we've given them this suite of characteristics, is anytime we meet somebody from that group, they have this whole suite of things. Think about this. Think about how this might work in your own life and how that might affect the way that you interact with other people. Anybody have much experience with stereotyping?
Larry, this is Tammy from Billings.
Go ahead, Jen.
I don't know so much about stereotyping, but just the characteristics of organizing a person in meeting new students in our studios, and then more so in particular siblings and how the different children in one family learn in different ways, and not putting them into those boxes that we want to stereotype or manage and organize, and then all of a sudden within a couple weeks after working and learning more with the student, all of those lines become blurred.
Yeah, I can remember a time I met I'm ex-military, and I think you know that from my brief biography. But I remember meeting a guy one time. He was a big, rough-looking guy. He had tattoos. He was wearing a leather jacket. He had a patch over one eye. And I kind of put him in this category of this membership category of biker. Okay, now I try my best not to stereotype, but I think a lot of times we do it, even if it's unconsciously. I was so surprised to find out that this guy was so kind and gentle, totally opposite from the way that I had initially perceived him. And I think we, as people, we really need to be aware that sometimes we do that, and it can definitely affect our communication and our interactions with them. It can affect the way they think about us. Anybody else questions or thoughts about stereotyping?
Larry?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Yeah, I'm an old white guy with no hair anymore. Especially younger people, 20s and early 30s, I've met. And I think I get put into the old white guy category. And if I can have a chance to talk with people and occupation comes up and I tell them I'm a piano teacher or a music teacher, private music teacher, I've noticed an immediate change in attitude towards me, usually a little kinder. So yeah, I've run into that. So
Okay, anybody else? Anybody else have any experiences themselves where they may have stereotyped someone and then come to find out that their initial impression was totally off?
I did one time. I'm so guilty of this. The big sister was awesome, practiced all the time, could really, really do well and play lots of good stuff. Little sister came along and I thought, oh, good, another one. And, you know, it just wasn't her thing as much. So guilty as charged.
All right, so we talked about organizing. We talked about the problems associated with stereotyping. The next step is where we actually attach meaning to the stimuli that we've selected and then placed in some kind of an organizing scheme. And the way we interpret based on our past experience, based on our expectations, based on our own self-esteem, there are a lot of factors that play in our relationship, a level of satisfaction with a particular relationship. And this process, these 3 steps here, I'm going to introduce another term for those 3 steps, and that's self-talk. And I want to plug that term in there because when we make sense out of people, or we make sense out of situations through our self-talk, very often that results in an emotion. It may be a mild emotion, it may be an intense emotion, but according to cognitive psychologists, at least, the way that we make sense of the events that we experience in our life is what actually results in our emotions. And I'll leave that just for a moment because I want to come back and introduce you to something called the ABC model and then talk about methods for minimizing strong emotions. But before we get there, I promised listening. Now, one of the assignments that I have my students do is to introduce them to the elements of the listening process. And then I have them think about situations where their listening broke down at one of these particular elements. Now, the first element in the listening process is hearing. So I have to be able to decode what somebody is saying to me. Hearing is physiological. A little while ago, when I asked you to pay attention to all the sounds, all the things that were going on around you, remember I said that physiologically, all those things were there, you just weren't paying attention to them. Now, the second is attending. The step in the perception process where I said we select certain stimuli, that's what we're doing right here. One of the problems associated with selection is that what we select isn't always what's most important. It just stands out more than other things. But attending is psychological. I like to have you think about multitasking for a minute. A lot of times we try to multitask, we try to do things where you really can't do those 2 things more than one thing and really focus on it at a time because what we select shifts back and forth. So if we're really fast at doing that, we can switch back and forth between these tasks that we're trying to do. It can work, but it doesn't work as well as it could if we strictly focused on one thing. Think about trying to have a conversation with somebody and they're checking their phone, they're looking at a clock, they're not making eye contact with you, they're trying to do other things at the same time when you would really like them to be paying attention to what you are telling them. The third element in this process is understanding. And this is where we interpret. It's that, so we select it, we organize, we interpret, we're making sense out of the message that somebody has given us. Ideally, the next element in the listening process is giving some kind of observable feedback to that other person. In the transactional model that I introduced you to before, we talked about, I talked primarily about messages. Feedback is just a message that we think of as in response to somebody else's message. But feedback is just a message. Now, when you're listening to somebody, if you're paying attention to them, you're going to give them nonverbal feedback as well as probably verbal feedback. Nodding your head, maintaining eye contact, maybe leaning forward toward them would be forms of nonverbal feedback. And something that we're going to talk about in a moment here is a form of verbal feedback. So the last part of this is remembering. It's very difficult, it can be very difficult, very challenging to remember what we hear. And one of the problems with listening is that we have a tendency when we are actually listening, we listen too hard. And we try to remember all these details. Well, it's really hard to do. We should be able to remember pertinent details and maybe some of the situational things that might be important to that message. But to try to remember everything is extremely difficult. So what I'd like you to do, now that I've introduced this, is I'd like you to think of a time when your listening failed at one of these particular elements. You didn't hear it, you didn't attend to it, you didn't understand it, you didn't give some kind of feedback to the other person to let them know that you understood their message or that you forgot it almost immediately. I'll give you 30 seconds to a minute, and then I'll see if I have any examples. Okay, anybody like to share one of their listening breakdowns?
Lynn from Billings Group.
Hi, Lynn.
That happens to me all the time when someone's introducing themselves. I want them to tell me it twice because when they first say their name, I'm thinking about so many things about, like you say, how they look or where I met them, have I seen them before, just a million things that you're thinking about. And they say their name, and then you realize you missed the name. And even anyway, if you're not attending, you can't remember that. So I feel like that's a critical time for listening is when someone's introducing themselves and you're not focused on so many other things going on, so you can actually remember.
Okay, good example. Anybody else? Well, I can share an example from my own past. A long time ago, back when I was in the military, the job I had kept me pretty busy with a lot of administrative things. And they had an administrative assistant that would come in and give me information. And what I tried to do was something I mentioned to you a little while ago. I tried to multitask. I tried to pay attention to what this person was saying at the same time that I was editing and trying to do 2 or 3 things at the same time. And what I wasn't doing is I wasn't giving that person the feedback that I truly was listening. The feedback that I was getting, that I later found out from this person, was that this person was interrupting me and that I really didn't like them coming in and doing that. Well, one time that person was going to give me some information that was really pretty important that I needed to know, and I had some negative outcome that resulted because I didn't get it. And I went and spoke with this person, and the person said, well, every time I come into your office, you act like I'm bothering you, and so I really just didn't want to bother you. Okay, my feedback, she misinterpreted my feedback, but I did not give adequate feedback. I should have stopped what I was doing, turned, faced that person, got eye contact, and then actually gave them some verbal and nonverbal feedback that I was paying attention. Pretty simple things, but a lot of times we forget how important they are. Anybody else have an example?
This is Sharon from Billings, and
Hi, Sharon.
one example that, not necessarily to me, but to anybody, if you happen to be in a discussion or an argument with someone, chances are you are listening to your point of view and not theirs.
Yep. Your point is very well taken. And that is really actually a good segue into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is active listening, paraphrasing or active listening. Counselors use this technique a lot. But you don't have to be a counselor to use it. It really is a really important skill that I think everybody should practice. And what paraphrasing or active listening is you are decoding a message from somebody else, you're processing it in your brain to try to understand it, and then you're feeding it back to that person as a way for them to cross-check so that they can understand, they can know that you understood what they said, or if you didn't understand it, it gives them a opportunity to give you some feedback to correct it. When I teach this class face-to-face, I usually do some paraphrasing practice in class. There are 3 ways that we can make our paraphrasing sound more natural. Because any communication technique, if it sounds canned, people are probably going to pick up on it and maybe have a negative opinion of you because you use it that way. So with practice, however, you can make these things sound very naturally. So the first way to package is, or to paraphrase, is to do just what I said. You decode, re-encode, feed it back. Now, you don't add anything to what that person said, and you don't parrot. If you repeat verbatim back to that person, if anyone of you has ever experienced parroting, it's yeah, it's what I said. Why are you repeating back to me the same thing that I just told you? They want to know that you comprehended what they said, that you understood it. So you have to repackage it, and that's the first way to make your paraphrasing sound more natural. A second way is to offer an example. So if somebody, and a lot of times if somebody is upset or they're in this heightened state of arousal, they may not be thinking very clearly, and they may be giving you some feedback that is very abstract and not specific. You may have to help them along by offering them an example of what they were talking about. So if somebody says that you never pay attention to them, you might, maybe that's true, maybe that's not true, but you might say, well, are you telling me this because of the time that you were trying to explain to me what you wanted to do for our vacation and I didn't share my thoughts with you? So offering an example will help them deal with that. Now, before I go to the final way, I want to point something out to you about listening. We think of listening as something that we always do. We don't always listen. But when we do listen and when we give that feedback to another person, what we're sending them is a very important relational message that we care. So if someone is upset with you because you're not listening, maybe it's because of or saying that you're not listening, maybe it's because of the feedback, the nonverbal feedback that you're giving them. It's perfectly fine to comprehend what somebody's saying, and that's a good thing. But if you don't let them know that you understood what they were saying, then they're kind of left in the dark and they think that you don't care about them, you're not interested, what they're saying is not important, any of a number of possible interpretations. The last way to make our paraphrasing sound natural is the method that I taught you early on in this session, and that's perception checking. Perception checking is a great way to provide that feedback to the other person. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever experienced a repetitive message for somebody. Hey, text me as soon as you get where you're going. Call me as soon as you get there. Now, don't forget, don't wait. When you get to where you're going, let me know. Well, these are all little examples that probably reflect an underlying theme. It's kind of like the tip of an iceberg, where a lot of the meaning is below the surface, and we're just getting these little vignettes up at the top. So you keep telling me that every time I go someplace to either text you or call you right away, are you worried that something's going to happen to me on the way, or do you think maybe I'm not being truthful with you about where I'm going? I'm wondering. Remember the 3 parts of a perception checking. Put in any order that you like. So there's different ways that we can practice good listening behavior. I want to pause momentarily and see if I have any questions before I move on.
This is Stephanie in Billings.
Hi, Stephanie.
That example you just gave is almost verbatim something that happened in our marriage early on. My husband would always want me to text him when I got where I was going or call or what have you. And if I didn't, he would get angry. And I interpreted it as a controlling issue. But finally, one day we were able to really talk about it. Well, his daughter died in a car accident. So he had this built-in fear. He was afraid, he was afraid something had happened. And once I understood that, it became like a teamwork thing, or I'm reassuring you everything's fine. I made it where I'm going. And it made such a difference in the relationship.
Okay, that's a terrific example. And it really ties into something that I'm going to talk about next, is how our perceptions affect our emotions. But anybody else, before I do that, does anyone else have a thought or a comment about that, or a question? Okay, was there a question? Did I cut somebody off? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and move forward. I'm going to take this off of here. And we've talked so far about the transactional model. We talked a little bit about the challenges sometimes of mediated communication. I introduced you to perception checking. We talked about some elements in the listening process. We mentioned briefly, or I mentioned briefly, and the last example that we had really ties into what I want to talk about now, and that is how our perceptions affect our emotions. The model that captures this, and it's cognitive psychologists use this. You can Google it or bang it or look it up. I keep a link to this on my Desire to Learn course management system that I use in my classes. But it goes something like this. I'll draw this up there first. So things happen in our lives. And remember, we're perceiving things, we're selecting certain things from all the stimuli that is available to us. Something stands out and we pay attention to it. That is called an activating event, something that was available to our senses. Now, once we have selected something, we have to make some sense out of it. And recall that when I was discussing the perception process, I talked about how organizing and interpreting, those steps were really our self-talk. Self-talk, the way that we explain things to ourselves, the way that we attach meaning to behavior. Now, it's the way that we attach meaning to behavior that has a consequence to it. And this consequence is very often a feeling or an emotion. I'm just wondering if I'm getting too far off of my board here. Nope, I'm not. Okay, so the issue is that perception is very subjective. And remember, when I talked about how we interpret messages, the way that we actually attach the meaning to them, is kind of like our past experience, like the person that was just sharing about her husband and the past experience with driving and having a personal tragedy. That affects the way that we attach meaning to certain other events. We assign a certain probability or a likelihood to something happening, and that will result in our feeling. But a lot of times our self-talk is not rational. What do I mean by rational? I mean logical. Does it make sense? Because sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes, because of our past experience, we choose attribution or meaning for some behavior that is in our head, but that really isn't the best explanation for that behavior. We have these little things based on our experiences in our life, and then when something happens, we draw them out and attach them to that particular behavior. Now, because our self-talk isn't always rational, isn't always logical, we have a feeling, sometimes a very strong feeling, an emotion that we really don't need to have. So a very famous psychologist by the name of Albert Ellis, sometime back in, I believe it was the 1950s, he came up with something called rational emotive therapy, later changed to rational emotive behavioral therapy, a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that has people challenge their self-talk to see if it's rational or not. Now I want to introduce some of the things that are called fallacies that we buy into sometimes that really aren't true or maybe aren't even likely to happen. And I think one of the biggest ones when I talk to my students is we tend to think the worst will happen if something occurs. So let's say that you're having a disagreement with a family member, and this you're assuming that your family member is trying to be mean or trying to be controlling, just doesn't care about you, cares about themselves. And as a result of that self-talk, the feeling maybe is resentment, or you're feeling hurt, associated behavior, maybe you kind of withdraw from this person. Well, maybe you were thinking, well, why don't I just go and talk to that person? Well, I don't know. If I go talk to that person, they'll probably just get more upset. And if they get more upset, we'll get in a big argument, and this thing will blow up all out of proportion. Other family members, you see where I'm going with this? I'm thinking the worst will happen. It's one of the fallacies, it's catastrophic expectations. Now, Ellis said, because a lot of times we do think irrationally, we need to be able to test that self-talk. And he has a method, and Adler and Proctor outline a version of that in the text that I use, and it's a 4-step process. I'll write it here and then I'll tie it into this model. The first thing that we have to do is to monitor our emotional reaction. Now, a lot of times we go through our day and we're experiencing a strong emotion, we don't even realize it. It might be, it's probably easy to recognize if it's one big event, but if there's a whole bunch of little stressors, and they have a tendency to build up, we may be carrying this around with us and not even know it. And that's noise. And that noise affects how we think and how we interact with other people. So the best thing to do is to try to deal with that emotion. But before I can deal with it, I've got to recognize it. Now there's a few ways, there's 4 ways that we can recognize when we're experiencing a strong emotion. One of those is physical. I've got butterflies in my stomach. I just got a big headache. Okay, my heart started racing. Internal physical things. I can recognize them, other people can't. The second is nonverbal. Your posture, your tone of voice. You know, you're kind of hanging slumped like this, or you find yourself raising your voice loud. That might be a pretty good clue that you're experiencing a strong emotion. Another is cognitive. And if you catch yourself ruminating, you're thinking over and over and over again about something, you're making maybe a negative feeling and even more intense because you keep thinking about it in your head. And the last is verbal. Sometimes you can pick up on a strong emotion by the things that you say. Now, once I have picked up on the fact that I'm experiencing a strong emotion, I've done C here. The second thing is to note the activating event. What was it that you reacted to? Was it something somebody said, something somebody did, something somebody didn't do? It wasn't the event itself that led to your feelings. It was the self-talk, the interpretation that you made about that event. So the third thing that we have to do then, according to that method, is to record our self-talk. This works really well when you're maybe in the evening reflecting on this after the fact, somebody cut you off in traffic, for example. You're driving down the road and all of a sudden, whoop, somebody's in front of you. And not only did they cut you off, but all of a sudden they slow down. Okay, you're in a hurry, you're trying to get to school. You've got a class that you've got to teach. And you can probably feel your face get red. Okay, maybe your heart rate increase when they cut in front of you. And maybe one of the first things that you think is, boy, that person sure was rude. They did that intentionally. They're selfish. They don't really care about other people. They don't care if anybody gets in a wreck. Well, is that really the most rational way to think about that behavior? So what might be some possible other reasons for that? Maybe that person just got in an argument with their significant other. Maybe they've got sick children at home. Maybe their boss is on them and threatening that if they don't get to work on a particular time, they're going to lose their job. I mean, who knows what kind of issues they're facing that led them to act that way. So,
Larry?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Was there a
We'll want to be able to hear the last part of this, the fourth part of this. And we're very near the end of our time. So if we could be
Okay.
more summative about it.
I'm going to get to it right now. Thank you. Yeah,
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. The last part of this is called reappraising. And the reappraisal process is just what I was talking about. You're trying to come up with another meaning for that original self-talk. So you have to say the first step in reappraising is the belief that I recorded up here, is it rational or irrational? Well, I don't know. Well, explain. Why is it rational? Why is it irrational? Now, if you identify that it's irrational, you replace it. And when you replace it, a lot of texts that you'll see refer to reappraising as dispute. You'll probably get a new feeling, hopefully, that isn't as strong as the one that you just experienced. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is this. Remember, I said that a lot of times when events happen in our lives, we pull this explanation out of our brains, and that's the one that we use. But when you reappraise your self-talk and you come up with other possible ways to process a message, to attach meaning to a message, the next time something like that happens, you're equally likely to draw that out and then maybe not have to suffer that strong emotion that you had before. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I think we have a couple of minutes. If you have questions you want to ask, I'd be happy to do that.
I think this is really helpful, and I'd love to take a whole class on it.
Well, I'd be happy to teach that class. I really love teaching this material. I've just scratched the surface today. There's so much more that I could cover, but one class is an hour and 15 minutes. So I didn't have quite as much time, but I still covered quite a bit. I hope I didn't go too fast for you all, but it was a pleasure, certainly a pleasure to interact with you. I wish I could have seen all your faces. That's all.
Well, it was excellent. And as usual, I kept thinking, gosh, it's just too bad there isn't more time. And it's so easy to, it's just so very interesting and so easy to get caught up in it for sure. I really appreciate that you would come and share. I did take the entire course, everyone. And he really did a fantastic job of addressing many parts of what we learned about. But with 1 hour, I'm just amazed right now.
Well, thank you all. Again, it was a pleasure, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. So thank you.